Find out what really inspired Moby Dick, the terrifying true story of the whale ship Essex, sunk in the Pacific by an enraged 85-ton sperm whale.
The year was 1819, and the island of Nantucket sat low in the Atlantic, a crescent of sand and ambition that smelled perpetually of money and death. To the uninitiated, the stench was revolting, a cloying, heavy miasma of rendering blubber, burning scraps, and the copper tang of blood that clung to the cobblestones and seeped into the clapboard houses. But to the men who walked the wharves, it was the incense of industry, the perfume of the Pacific brought home in barrels. George Pollard, Jr., newly minted captain of the whale ship Essex, stood on the quarterdeck, his knuckles white as he gripped the rail. He was 28 years old, a man of slight build but heavy burdens. The Essex was not a new ship. She was 20 years old, a veteran of the southern Atlantic, her timbers soaked in the oil of 1,000 leviathans. She was small, barely 87 feet long, squat and sturdy, a workhorse rather than a racehorse. Yet as Pollard looked out over the harbor, watching the gray water slap against the hull, he felt the weight of the island's expectation. He was a Pollard, a name that carried currency in Nantucket, but names did not lance whales, and lineage did not survive storms. The command was his, but the respect was something he would have to carve out of the ocean, one barrel at a time.
Below him, the deck was a hive of controlled chaos. Men rolled casks, coiled ropes, and shouted orders that were swallowed by the wind. Among them moved Owen Chase, the first mate. If Pollard was the brooding conscience of the ship, Chase was its clenched fist. 2 years younger than the captain, Chase possessed a physical vitality that bordered on aggression. He moved with a predatory grace, barking orders that were obeyed not out of deference to his rank, but out of fear of his temper. Chase was ambitious, hungering for a command of his own, and he viewed this voyage not merely as a job, but as a stepping stone. He checked the stowage of the harpoons with a critical eye, running his thumb along the razor edge of a toggle iron. It drew blood, a thin red line that he wiped casually on his trousers. The omen was not lost on him, but he dismissed it. Whaling was a business of blood. A little more would not matter.
The Essex slipped her moorings on a tide of high hopes and stoic farewells. The Quaker influence of Nantucket meant there were no brass bands, no hysterical weeping, just the solemn nods of fathers and the tight-lipped gazes of wives who knew that the sea was a jealous mistress who kept their men for years at a time. As the lighthouse faded into the gray mist astern, the reality of their confinement set in. 21 men, bound together by wood and canvas, sailing toward the bottom of the world. The Atlantic crossing was a grueling repetition of drills and discipline. Pollard, eager to prove his competence, ran a tight ship, but it was Chase who enforced the will. The men were a motley collection, seasoned Nantucketers with salt in their veins and green hands from the mainland, boys who had fled farms and factories for the romance of the sea, only to find that the romance was a lie told by recruiters. The reality was the try-works, the brick oven built into the deck, waiting to be lit. The reality was the endless scraping of the hull, the mending of sails, the food that rotted by degrees. Hardtack became infested with weevils, the water turned green in the casks, and the beef became a salty leather that required hours of chewing. Yet the routine was a shield. It kept the mind from dwelling on the terrifying vastness beneath the keel.
Weeks turned into months. They rounded Cape Horn, a passage of screaming winds and mountainous waves that tested the old ship's frame. Changed. It became a vast blue desert, deceptive in its calmness. They were hunting sperm whales, the monarchs of the deep,
prized for the spermaceti in their massive box-like heads, a waxy substance that burned with a pure, bright light, illuminating the streets of London and New York. The hunt, when it finally came, was a burst of violence that shattered the boredom. "There she blows!" The cry from the masthead galvanized the crew. The lethargy of months evaporated in seconds. Men scrambled into the whaleboats, the davits creaking as they were lowered into the swell. This was the moment of truth. Pollard took his place at the steering oar of his boat, Chase in his. They rowed with a desperation that strained muscles to the tearing point. The whale, a bull of respectable size, lay logging on the surface, a dark island in the sun-drenched water. The approach had to be silent. The paradox of whaling was that one had to be a ghost before becoming a butcher.
Chase's boat took the lead. The harpooner, a massive man named Thomas Nickerson, stood in the bow, the iron poised. With a grunt of exertion, he hurled it. The iron struck true, sinking deep into the blubber. The reaction was instantaneous. The whale did not die. It exploded into fury. The Nantucket sleigh ride began. The boat towed at breakneck speed behind the thrashing beast, the line smoking as it ran through the chocks, water spraying in a blinding sheet. It was terror and exhilaration distilled into a pure, potent draft. When the beast finally tired, the lance was driven into its lungs. The chimneys afire, the spray of blood from the blowhole signaled the end. The sea turned a murky crimson, and the majestic creature became merely cargo. Then began the rendering. The try-works were lit, and the Essex became a floating factory of hell. Smoke, thick and oily, billowed from the stacks, coating everything in a layer of grime. The men, stripped to the waist, looked like demons tending the fires of the underworld. They sliced the blubber into Bible leaves and tossed them into the cauldrons. The smell was overpowering, a sweet, sickly stench of burning fat that permeated hair, skin, and soul. They worked in shifts, day and night, until the whale was nothing but oil in barrels and ash in the wind.
This cycle repeated again and again, but the barrels filled slowly. The easy grounds were fished out. Economic necessity, the cruelest captain of all, drove them further. Pollard made the decision to head for the offshore grounds, a remote expanse of the Pacific thousands of miles from the coast of South America. It was a place absent from many charts, a void on the map where the only law was survival. As they pushed deeper into this uncharted blue wilderness, the isolation began to weigh on them. The camaraderie of the mess deck grew brittle. Arguments flared over trivialities. The silence of the ocean was amplified, pressing against the hull. It was in this atmosphere of strained nerves that they encountered another whaler, a ship homeward bound. They held a gam, an exchange of news and letters. The visiting captain was a haggard man, his eyes hollow. He spoke of the offshore grounds not with the optimism of a hunter, but with the caution of a survivor. He whispered of changes in the behavior of the whales. "They're learning," he said, his voice low, glancing at the sea as if it were listening. "They used to run. Now, some of them, they fight. There is a malice out there, Captain Pollard, a spirit in the water." Pollard dismissed it as sailor's superstition, the rambling of a man too long at sea. Chase laughed it off openly, mocking the fear. But the crew heard. The seed of unease was planted. The ocean, once a hunting ground, now felt like a hostile territory. The water seemed darker, the horizon more confining.
November 1820 arrived with a deceptive calm. The sun beat down on the Essex with a relentless, hammering intensity. The pitch bubbled in the deck seams. The sails hung limp, gasping for a breeze. On the morning of the 20th, the lookout spotted a pod of whales off the leeward bow. The routine kicked in.
but there was a heaviness to the movements, a lethargy born of the oppressive heat and the lingering dread from the rumors. The boats were lowered. Chase harpooned a whale, but the shell of the creature struck his boat, stove a hole in it. He was forced to cut the line and return to the Essex for repairs. It was while he was on the deck, hammering canvas over the breach, that the atmosphere shifted. The wind died completely. The silence was absolute, a vacuum of sound that made the blood roar in the ears. Then he saw it. Not a pod, one whale, but it was not like any whale they had ever seen. It was a male sperm whale of colossal proportions, easily 85 feet in length, its skin a scarred map of underwater battles, gray fading to a ghostly white at the head. It did not flee, it did not log. It lay off the bow, facing the ship. Its blow was a low, steady hiss, rhythmic and calm.
Chase froze, the hammer falling from his hand. He walked to the rail, mesmerized. The beast was swimming slowly toward them. It wasn't the frantic charge of a frightened animal. It was the deliberate approach of a thinking adversary. As it drew closer, Chase could see the eye. It was small in the vastness of the head, but it was alive with a terrifying intelligence. It rolled in its socket, fixing its gaze not on the water, but on the ship itself, on the men. There was no instinctual fear in that gaze, only a cold calculation, a malevolence that transcended the animal kingdom. The water around the whale seemed to boil without heat, a disturbance of pure power. The rumors of the offshore grounds, the whispers of the demon whales, crashed into Chase's mind with the force of a breaking wave. This was not a hunt. The roles had reversed. The apex predator of the ocean had decided to confront the intruder. The calm before the storm had ended. The storm had arrived, and it breathed air. Pollard, in the distance in his own boat, stood up, shading his eyes, realizing too late that the true danger was not the whale on his line, but the monster approaching his ship. The separation between man and nature, the barrier of technology and wood that they had relied upon for safety, was about to be obliterated. The whale accelerated.
The mallet struck the iron hoop with a dull, rhythmic clang that seemed to be the only sound in the entire universe, a solitary note of industry suspended in the vast, oppressive silence of the Pacific. First Mate Owen Chase wiped a slurry of sweat and grease from his forehead with the back of a raw, blistered hand, his eyes stinging from the salt that hung invisible in the stagnant air. The Essex drifted lazily, a wooden splinter floating in an endless void of deep, indifferent blue. It was November 20th, 1820, a day that had dawned with the mundane promise of repairs and the hopeful monotony of the hunt. But the air held a heaviness that pressed against the lungs, a barometric weight that whispered of unseen currents shifting beneath the surface. The crew moved with the lethargic precision of men worn down by months at sea, their movements economical, their voices reduced to grunts and low murmurs. There was no wind to speak of, only the gentle, rhythmic heaving of the ocean, a sleeping giant breathing in its slumber. Thomas Nickerson, the cabin boy, was coiling a rope near the main hatch, his young face etched with a premature weariness, the sun having bleached his hair to the color of dried straw. He looked up at the sky, a vast dome of pale, merciless azure, searching for a cloud, a bird, anything to break the terrifying emptiness of the horizon. There was nothing, just the sun, a white-hot coin burning a hole in the fabric of the sky, and the ocean stretching out to the edges of the world, deep and impenetrable. The ship creaked, a familiar, comforting groan of timber settling against water, a sound that usually signified safety, a barrier between the men and the abyss. But today, the sound seemed hollow, fragile. Chase straightened his back, feeling the vertebrae pop, and looked out over the port rail. The water was calm, glassy, reflecting the sky with a distortion that made the world feel inverted. He was a man of logic,
of hard facts and nautical charts, but a shiver traced the line of his spine, a primal instinct flaring to life in the base of his brain. Something was wrong. The silence was too absolute. It was not the peace of nature, but the held breath of a predator before the strike. Then came the cry. It did not originate from the masthead with the usual jubilant cadence of "there she blows," but rather erupted from the water itself, a sound of rushing displacement like a waterfall suddenly birthed in the middle of the sea. Chase spun around, his eyes locking onto the disturbance off the bow. A pod of whales lay there, calm, unsuspecting, the targets of their morning's labor. But beyond them, separated by a stretch of dark water, something else broke the surface. It was not merely a whale, it was a monolith of gray flesh, a scarred, barnacle-encrusted mountain rising from the deep. It was a bull sperm whale of colossal proportions, easily 85 feet in length, its bulk eclipsing anything Chase had ever witnessed in his years on the whaling grounds. But it was not the size that froze the blood in Chase's veins, it was the behavior. Whales were skittish creatures, fleeing at the first sign of danger, or thrashing in blind panic when harpooned. This beast was different. It lay motionless on the surface, its massive head, the case, pointing directly at the Essex. A jet of vapor shot from its blowhole, not a rhythmic spout, but a sharp, angry hiss. The water around it seemed to boil, churned by the subtle, powerful movements of its flukes. Chase gripped the rail, his knuckles turning white. He could see the creature's eye, a dark, intelligent orb set deep within the wrinkles of its massive head. It was not looking at the ocean, it was looking at the ship.
The impact was not a crash, but a cataclysm. The whale struck the ship just forward of the forechains, the massive, blunt head slamming into the oak planks with the force of a cannonball. The entire vessel shuddered violently, a convulsion that threw men off their feet and sent equipment skittering across the deck like terrified crabs. The sound was sickening, a deep, resonant thud followed by the sharp, agonizing crack of timber giving way. Dust and oakum flew into the air as the seams of the ship groaned in protest. Chase was thrown hard against the rail, the breath driven from his lungs. For a moment, the world was a blur of spinning wood and sky. He scrambled to his feet, his ears ringing, the taste of copper in his mouth. The ship rocked wildly, listing to the side before righting itself with a sluggish, wounded motion. "He hit us!" someone screamed, the voice bordering on hysteria. "The beast rammed us!" Chase looked over the side. The water around the bow was churning, clouded with debris. The whale had passed under the ship, scraping the keel with a sound like grinding stones, and was now surfacing on the starboard side. It lay there for a moment, stunned, rolling in the swells. Its head was scarred, bleeding slightly from the impact, but it was alive, it was conscious. And then, as Chase watched in horror, the whale shook its head, a gesture so human, so expressive of irritation and renewed resolve that it chilled him to the marrow. It was not finished. The crew of the Essex scrambled in a chaotic frenzy. Captain Pollard, who had been below, burst onto the deck, his face a mask of pale shock. "What in God's name has happened?" he shouted, his eyes darting from the listing bow to the stunned crew. "A whale, sir," Chase reported, his voice steady despite the trembling of his hands. "He has breached us! We are taking on water!" The reality of the situation began to set in. The pumps were manned, the rhythmic clanking adding a desperate tempo to the chaos. Men ran with buckets, with planks, with anything that might stem the tide. But deep down, in the cold pit of his stomach, Chase knew it was futile. He looked out at the whale. The beast had recovered. It was swimming away, putting distance between itself and the ship. For a fleeting second, Chase hoped it was fleeing, satisfied with the damage it had wrought. But then the creature turned. It wheeled around with a grace that belied its immense size, aligning its body once more with the crippled Essex. It was 600 yards away now, a dark silhouette against the blinding sun. It paused, gathering its strength, telegraphing its intent with a terrifying clarity.
This was not a random collision. This was an execution. "My God," Pollard whispered, gripping the taffrail. "He is coming again!" The second charge was different. There was no hesitation, no testing of the waters. The whale surged forward, its speed doubling, tripling. It held its head high above the water, the foam curling around its jaws like the froth of a rabid dog. Could see the barnacles on its snot, the scars of 1,000 battles, the sheer unstoppable mass of the creature. It was a locomotive of flesh, aimed with geometric precision at the ship's port bow. The crew fell silent. The frantic activity ceased. Men stood rooted to the spot, mesmerized by the approaching death. There was nothing to be done. No maneuver could save them. No harpoon could stop this avalanche of rage. Chase found himself observing the scene with a detached, surreal clarity. He noticed the way the sunlight caught the spray, the way the rigging hummed in the wind, the way the silence of the ocean seemed to deepen, waiting for the violence to come. He realized in that frozen moment that they were not the masters of this domain.
The second impact was the sound of the world ending. The whale struck the bow directly under the cathead, just as the ship pitched down into a swell. The collision was absolute. The sound was not a thud, but a shattering, a splintering of massive oak beams that echoed across the empty ocean like a thunderclap. The ship did not just shudder. It stopped dead in the water, the kinetic energy transferring instantly into destruction. Planks snapped like twigs, the stem was crushed, the hull was breached wide open, a fatal wound that let the ocean pour in with a roar of triumph. Water rushed into the hold, not as a leak, but as a torrent, a deluge that swept away barrels, chests, and the hopes of 20 men. The Essex groaned, a long, drawn-out scream of dying wood, and began to list heavily to the port side. The whale, its purposefully filled, bounced off the shattered hull and disappeared beneath the keel, vanishing into the depths from which it had come, leaving behind only the wreckage of its wrath. "Abandon ship!" the cry went up, desperate and shrill. The spell of terror broke, replaced by the frantic instinct for survival. It was no longer about saving the ship, it was about saving the minutes left to them. The deck was tilting aggressively now, the angle becoming steeper with every heartbeat. "The boats! Get the boats!" Chase bellowed, throwing himself at the lashings of the spare whaleboat. His fingers fumbled with the knots, slick with sweat and fear. Around him, men were scrambling, sliding on the inclined deck, grabbing whatever they could. Bread, water, navigational instruments, a compass, a quadrant. These were the new currencies of their existence. The steward, a man named William Bond, emerged from the flooding cabin clutching a small trunk. "The captain's trunk!" he gasped, heaving it into one of the boats. It was a futile gesture, saving clothes and papers while the world dissolved, but it was an act of order in a universe gone mad. The sounds were a cacophony of terror, the roar of the incoming water, the screech of nails pulling free from wood, the shouts of men calling out names, checking for friends, ensuring no one was trapped below. Lowering the boats was a nightmare of physics and panic. The ship was listing so badly that the starboard boats were hanging high in the air, while the port boats were nearly touching the water. Men leaped into the frail crafts, oars clattering, hearts hammering against ribs like trapped birds. Chase practically threw himself into his boat, grabbing the tiller. "Cut the falls!" he screamed. Knives flashed in the sunlight, severing the ropes that bound them to the dying Leviathan. The boats dropped into the swell, rocking violently. They pushed away from the hull, oars digging frantically into the water, desperate to escape the suction of the sinking vessel. They rowed 10 yards, 20, 50, putting distance between themselves and the vortex. Then, by unspoken agreement, they stopped. The oars rested. The men turned. They watched the Essex die. It was a slow, agonizing death. The ship, once their home, their fortress, their entire world, was now a broken toy. The bow dipped lower, the stern rising into the air, exposing the copper sheathing that glinted mockingly in the sun. The masts, tall and proud, tilted towards the horizon. The water reached the main deck, washing over the hatchways, swallowing the capstan, the try-works, the familiar geography of their daily lives. There was a terrible majesty to it, a final surrender to the elements. With a final, gurgling groan, the ship rolled completely onto its side. The masts slapped the water, sending up a spray of white, and then the hull settled, sinking lower, lower, until only the very tops of the masts were visible, and then they too were gone. The ocean closed over the spot where the Essex had been, the water swirling in a turbulent pool of bubbles and debris. A few barrels bobbed to the surface, a spar, a hat, but the ship was gone. Captain Pollard sat in the stern of his boat, his face a mask of ashen gray, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his cheeks. He stared at the empty patch of ocean, his lips moving in a silent prayer, or perhaps a curse. He had lost his command. He had lost his ship. He was the captain of nothing but a few planks of wood and a crew of terrified men. Chase looked around at the three small boats, bobbing like corks in the immense indifference of the Pacific. The silence returned, heavier now than before. The wind had died completely. The sun beat down with undiminished intensity. They were thousands of miles from the coast of South America, surrounded by the deepest ocean on Earth, with minimal provisions and no shelter. The terror of the attack had faded, replaced by a colder, deeper horror, the realization of their absolute abandonment. The Leviathan had done its work. It had stripped them of their technology, their protection, their civilization, and left them naked before the elements. Chase looked down into the dark water, half expecting to see the great eye of the whale staring back at him, watching, waiting, but there was only the blue, endless and deep. The wrath of the Leviathan had passed, leaving in its wake the slow, grinding torture of survival.
The ocean did not mourn the Essex. It swallowed the ship with a terrifying, indifferent efficiency, the great timber carcass groaning once before slipping beneath the surface of the Pacific, leaving behind nothing but a chaotic swirl of white foam and the bobbing detritus of a destroyed life. For the 20 men left floating in 3 fragile open whaleboats, the silence that followed was heavier than the crash of the whale's impact. It was a silence that screamed. Captain George Pollard sat in the stern of his boat, his hand gripping the tiller with such ferocity that his knuckles shone like bleached bone through his weathered skin. He stared at the spot where his command, his livelihood, and his home had existed only moments before. Now there was only the vast, undulating blue, a mirror of the sky, stretching out to a horizon that felt infinite and oppressive. The adrenaline that had fueled their frantic evacuation, the primal scream of survival that had driven them to hack at ropes and toss casks into the boats, began to drain away, replaced by a cold, creeping dread that settled in the marrow of their bones. The water around them was calm, deceptively so, masking the miles of depth beneath their keels. First Mate Owen Chase in the adjacent boat was the first to break the paralysis. His voice, usually a boom that cut through gale winds, sounded thin and brittle in the open air. "Pull in," he rasped, his eyes darting between the 3 boats. "Lash them together. We take stock before the light fails." The men moved like automatons, their movements sluggish, their minds unable to process the magnitude of their catastrophe. Oars dipped into the water, the sound of wood on water echoing like gunshots in a cathedral. As the 3 boats bumped against each other, the intimacy of their situation became horrifyingly clear. 20 men, usually spread across the decks and rigging of a 238-ton whaler, were now compressed into shells of cedar hardly longer than the whales they hunted. The smell of the ocean was overpowering, salt, rot and the metallic tang of fear. Pollard looked at his men. He saw the reflection of his own terror in the eyes of the cabin boy, Thomas Nickerson. The boy was shivering, though the equatorial sun was beating down with a hammer's force. "What do we have?" Pollard asked, his voice steadying through sheer will. "Report." The inventory was a grim litany of insufficiency. They rummaged through the chaotic piles of salvaged goods. There were 2 quadrants, 2 Bowditch navigators, and 2 compasses, tools to tell them exactly where they were and exactly how hopeless their position was. For food, they had salvaged 600 pounds of hardtack, dry, rock-hard biscuits that were already beginning to soak up the spray of the sea. There were a few tortoises from the Galapagos, living larders that scratched mournfully against the boat's ribs. But it was the water that terrified Pollard. A few small casks, 65 gallons, for 20 men in the middle of the Pacific. Pollard did the mental arithmetic instantly, and the result was a death sentence. "It is not enough," Chase muttered, leaning over the gunwale, his face a mask of soot and dried salt. "Not for where we need to go." The boats drifted, tethered by ropes, a tiny constellation of misery in a universe of water. The sun began its descent, turning the ocean into a sheet of hammered copper, beautiful and deadly. The heat was already rising, baking the moisture from their skin, cracking their lips. They needed a plan. They needed a direction. Pollard unfolded the charts, the parchment crinkling in the humid air. The men leaned in, their breath catching.
"They say the tribes of the Marquesas are fierce," second mate Matthew Joy added, his voice weak. He was already sickly, his constitution failing even before the wreck. "They capture sailors. They feast on flesh." Pollard looked at the map again. He looked at the wind. He knew the Marquesas were the best chance, but he looked at the faces of his crew, hollow, terrified, pleading. He saw that they would not follow him into the cooking pots of savages. He felt his authority crumbling, not under mutiny, but under the collective weight of their nightmares. "Then where?" Pollard asked, though he knew the answer they wanted. "South," Chase said, pointing towards the bottom of the map. "South until we hit the variable winds, then east to the coast of Chile or Peru." Pollard stared at the distance. It was over 3,000 miles. 3,000 miles across the desolate heart of the Pacific, against the prevailing winds, against the currents. It was a journey that required a miracle. It was a journey of months, not weeks. That is twice the distance," Pollard whispered, "and we will be fighting the wind every inch of the way." "Better to fight the wind than to be eaten," Chase countered, his jaw set. The murmur of agreement from the boats was the final gavel strike. The decision was made. In a moment of fateful, tragic irony, the men of the Essex chose to sail away from islands of safety, driven by a phantom fear, directly into the maw of a slow, agonizing death by starvation. They chose the civilized death of the open ocean over the imagined savagery of the islands. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging them into a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical weight, the reality of their choice began to settle. They unlashed the boats, forming a line, tethered only by the fragile hope that they could stay together in the vastness. The first night was a torment of cold. Without the shelter of the ship, the temperature plummeted. The men huddled together, shivering violently, their wet clothes clinging to them like shrouds. The sea, which had been a flat plain during the day, came alive at night. Unseen creatures bumped against the hulls. The sound of breathing, great wet exhalations surrounded them. Whales, the very creatures they had hunted, were now the masters of this domain, and the men were the intruders, small and trembling in their eggshell boots. Dawn brought no relief, only the return of the tyrant sun. It rose with a glare that seared the retina, transforming the ocean into a blinding mirror. The strict rationing began immediately. Pollard, his face grave, held up a single biscuit.
"One of these," he announced, his voice raspy. "Half a pint of water. Per man, per day." The men stared at the biscuit. It was nothing, a mouthful of dust, but it was life. They ate with ritualistic slowness, catching every crumb in their palms, licking the salt from their fingers. The water was measured out in a tin cup, passed from trembling hand to trembling hand. It tasted of the wood of the cask, of stagnation, but it was sweeter than wine. Days bled into a grim routine. The sun rose, cooked them, and set, leaving them to freeze. The boats, heavily laden and unseaworthy for such a voyage, took on water constantly. The men bailed until their shoulders burned and their hands blistered. To protect their meager supplies, they built up the sides of the boats with cedar weatherboards torn from the wreckage, raising the gunwales by half a foot. It was a flimsy defense against the Pacific swells that threatened to swamp them with every crest. The physical toll was immediate. Lips cracked and bled, tongues swelled in dry mouths, skin blistered and peeled, leaving raw, weeping flesh exposed to the salt spray.
The unity of the crew, forged in the hierarchy of the ship, began to fray under the pressure of the void. In Chase's boat, a dispute broke out over the distribution of the water. "He took more than his share," a sailor cried, pointing a shaking finger at his neighbor. "I saw him tilt the cup." Chase silenced them with a raised oar, his eyes burning with a dangerous light. "The next man who fights," Chase growled, "goes over the side. We are dead men if we turn on each other." But the seed was planted. Suspicion, paranoia. The ocean was too big, the boat too small. Every breath, every movement of a shipmate became an irritation. The sound of chewing, the smell of unwashed bodies, the muttering of prayers, it all grated on the nerves, stripping away the veneer of civilization. By the fifth day, the ocean had ceased to be a place and had become a presence, a malevolent, sentient entity that toyed with them. They saw ships on the horizon that vanished when they blinked. They heard voices in the wind calling their names. The isolation was total. They were 1,000 miles from the nearest land, drifting in a blue purgatory. Pollard spent hours staring at the compass, willing the needle to show them a favor, but the winds remained obstinate, pushing them relentlessly away from their salvation. He thought of the decision to turn south. He replayed the counsel in his mind 1,000 times. Had he been stronger, had he ordered them to the Marquesas, they might be feasting on breadfruit and fresh pork by now. Instead, they were gnawing on hardtack that tasted of despair. The ocean stretched out, a boundless prison of their own making. The salt encrusted their eyelashes, making it painful to blink. The sun hammered the top of their skulls, and beneath the boat, in the dark, cool depths, the sharks began to gather, sensing the vibrations of distress, waiting for the inevitable offerings that this tragic flotilla would provide. The hunter had become the prey, and the long, slow attrition of the Essex survivors had begun. The sun did not rise, it assaulted them. It breached the eastern horizon not as a herald of a new day, but as a tyrant returning to his throne, bringing with it a white, blinding malice that seared the eyes and flayed the spirit. Days had long since bled into a shapeless, fluid continuum where time was measured only by the agony of the throat and the receding shadow of the gunwales. The distinct separation of weeks had dissolved into a singular, monotonous epoch of suffering. The Pacific, vast and indifferent, stretched out like a sheet of hammered lead, reflecting the celestial fire with a cruelty that felt personal, seemingly designed to boil the fluids within their very veins. In the beginning, there had been orders. There had been the rigid discipline of the Nantucket whaling code. Captain Pollard had commanded, and the men had moved with the muscle memory of sailors. But now, the hierarchy of the ship was being eroded by the biology of survival. The initial meager rations, those precious ounces of hardtack that tasted of dust and weevils, and the thimble-sized allocations of water were stretched to their absolute physical limit. They became a religious ritual, a sacrament of crumbs and drops that offered no salvation, only a prolongation of the torture. The bread was dry as sand, absorbing the little moisture that remained in their mouths, requiring a painful effort to swallow. The water, warm and tasting of the wood of the cask, evaporated from their tongues before it could soothe the burning in their gullets. As the sun climbed higher, reaching its zenith, the heat became a physical weight, pressing down upon their shoulders like a yoke of hot iron. The men sat slumped on the thwarts, their posture collapsing inward. The blisters on their skin, initially small bubbles of clear fluid, had burst and festered, turning into ragged, weeping sores that refused to heal. The salt spray, once the smell of their trade and their livelihood, was now an acid that scoured these wounds, drawing sharp hisses of breath from cracked, bleeding lips. Faces that had once been flushed with the vigor of the hunt were now hollowed out, the skin pulled tight over the zygomatic arches, turning them into a crew of gaunt specters. Their eyes, recessed deep into dark sockets, glittered with a feverish, unnatural light, or else were glazed over with a dull bovine stupor. They looked less like men and more like anatomical studies of decay, sketched in charcoal and ash against the backdrop of an infinite mocking blue. Conversations, which in the first week had been fueled by desperate optimism and plans for navigation, had ceased entirely. To speak was to waste moisture. To argue was to expend energy they did not possess. The silence of the boat was broken only by the lap of water against the hull, the creak of dry wood, and the weak, rhythmic groans of the dying. It was a silence that carried weight, a suffocating blanket of apathy that settled over them, heavier than the heat. Among the crew, the psychological disintegration was as palpable as the physical rot. In the second mate's boat, a young sailor named Thomas, hardly more than a boy, had begun to stare at the ocean with a longing that terrified his shipmates. The sea around them was crystal clear, a beautiful, deadly azure that promised coolness and abundance. To the dehydrated mind, the salt water ceased to be a poison and transformed into a siren's draught. The delusion set in slowly. Thomas began to whisper to the waves, his voice a raspy caricature of sound. He spoke of rivers in Connecticut, of cold well water in tin ladles, of the ice breaking on the harbor in winter. The men around him, too weak to restrain him effectively, watched with a mixture of pity and horror.
The days that followed the first death blurred into a haze of delirium. The hunger became a sharp, gnawing beast in the belly and faded into a dull, consuming ache that seemed to digest the body from the inside out. Muscles atrophied at an accelerated rate. The men found they could no longer lift the heavy oars. Simply holding their heads up became a Herculean task. The sun continued its relentless bombardment. Skin turned the color of old mahogany, then black, cracking and peeling in sheets. Lips swelled until they split, bleeding scabs that reformed and broke with every grimace. The horizon remained empty, a perfect 360-degree circle of hopelessness. Some men retreated entirely into their minds, catatonic, staring at their feet, unresponsive to the lash of the sun or the spray of the sea. Others wept silently, tears they could not afford to shed drying on their cheeks in white streaks of salt. Then the atmosphere shifted. It began with a subtle drop in pressure, a heaviness in the air that pressed against the eardrums. The relentless blue of the sky was bruised by creeping tendrils of violet and slate gray on the southern horizon.
The wind, which had been a fitful, taunting breeze, died completely, leaving the sea an oily, undulating mirror. Then it returned, cold and sharp, whipping the tops of the swells into white foam. The ocean, previously a passive tormentor, woke up. The swells grew larger, transforming from rolling hills into moving mountains of water, dark and menacing. The small whaleboats, mere chips of wood in the vastness, rose and fell with nauseating amplitude. The captain signaled to the other boats, shouting across the widening gaps, his voice snatched away by the rising gale. They tried to keep the boats tethered to maintain the fragile psychological safety of the flotilla, but the ocean had other plans. Night brought the storm in its full fury. Rain fell, not as a blessing, but as bullets, cold and hard, driven by a howling wind. They tried to catch it in sails and mouths, a desperate, frantic scramble for hydration amidst the chaos, but the salt spray contaminated everything. The waves towered over them, black walls that blocked out the stars, crashing down with the force of a landslide. The men bailed frantically, the instinct for survival overriding the lethargy of starvation. They bailed with hats, with cups, with bare hands, fighting a losing battle against the encroaching sea. In the confusion, amidst the roar of the wind and the thunder of the waves, the visual connection between the boats was severed. A rogue wave, massive and curling, lifted the captain's boat and hurled it into a trough, obscuring the world in walls of water. When they crested the next peak, straining their eyes through the gloom and the stinging spray, the other boats were gone. They screamed into the darkness, names of shipmates, names of friends, but the wind swallowed their cries. The lantern of the second mate's boat was a pinprick of light that flickered and vanished, swallowed by the distance and the curvature of the earth. The separation was a psychological blow heavier than the thirst. As long as they were a fleet, however small, there was a semblance of society, a structure of civilization. Alone, they were merely prey. The storm raged for hours, tossing them like dice in a giant's hand, until finally the dawn broke. It was a gray, dreary dawn, revealing a churning, angry sea and an empty horizon. The other boats were gone. They were alone in a universe of water. The realization settled over them like a shroud. The apathy returned, deeper now, darker. The struggle continued, but the hope that had sustained them, the fragile thread connecting them to the world of men, had snapped.
The sun did not rise so much as it bled into existence, a septic wound in the gray pallor of the eastern horizon that offered no warmth, only a harsh, revealing illumination of their ruin. The whaleboat, once a vessel of industry and hope, had become a floating ossuary, a cradle of slow decay bobbing upon an indifferent and infinite abyss. For days, or was it weeks, time had dissolved into a fluid loop of agony. The hardtack was a phantom memory, a crumb of nostalgia that tormented the mind more than the belly. The water casks were dry, their staves shrinking in the heat, smelling of ancient brine and despair. Starvation was no longer an external threat, a specter haunting the gunwales. It had moved inside. It was a physical tenant. It sat in the marrow of their bones, a cold, scraping chisel that hollowed them out from within. It was an active, gnawing force, a parasite that had consumed the fat, then the muscle, and was now negotiating with the very architecture of their souls. Elias sat in the stern, his hand resting on the tiller more out of muscle memory than any true navigational intent. There was nowhere to steer. The ocean was a flat, hammered sheet of copper, reflecting the punishing glare of the zenith. His eyes, sunken deep into sockets that looked like bruised thumbprints in wet clay, swept over his companions. They were hardly men anymore. They were gargoyles carved from driftwood, skin stretched tight over sharp angles, lips cracked and bleeding, blackened by the sun and the lack of hydration. Opposite him sat Finch, the youngest, whose weeping had ceased 3 days ago, replaced by a catatonic staring contest with the bottom boards.
Near the bow was Morgan, the massive harpooner, now reduced to a mound of trembling rags, his great strength evaporated, leaving behind a frame that looked too large for the life flickering weakly inside it. And between them, lying prone on the thwarts, was Dalton. Dalton had been dying for 2 days. The sound of his breathing had been the metronome of their suffering, a wet, rasping rattle that hitched and dragged, sounding like sandpaper pulled across stone. In the silence of the doldrums, where not even a gull cried, that rattle was a thunderclap. It was the sound of the hourglass running out. Elias watched the rise and fall of Dalton's chest, the movement shallow, spasmodic. Every inhale was a theft from the air, every exhale a surrender. The other men watched too. They did not watch with the fraternal concern of shipmates who had weathered storms and shared grog. They watched with a fixity that was unnerving, a gaze that was stripped of humanity and replaced by something ancient, primal, and terrifying. They watched him not as a man, but as a possibility. The heat of the afternoon intensified, baking the salt into their sores. The smell in the boat was atrocious. A cocktail of unwashed bodies, gangrenous wounds, stagnant bilge water, and the sweet, sickly scent of ketosis radiating from their pores. Dalton let out a long, shuddering sigh. It was the sound of finality, a release of tension that seemed to ripple through the very wood of the hull. Then, silence. The rasping stopped. The chest ceased its pitiful heave. The silence that followed was heavier than the heat, pressing down on their eardrums, roaring in its absolute void. No one moved. According to the rites of the sea, the traditions they had held sacred since they were boys climbing the rigging, this was the moment for prayer. This was the moment to sew the hammock, to weight the feet with shot, to commit the body to the deep with a solemn word and a heavy heart. But no one moved. No one spoke. The body of Dalton lay there, cooling in the tropical air, and the space between the survivors and the corpse seemed to shrink.
"We cannot let him go to waste," Morgan said. The words were out. The seal was broken. The horror of the sentence was matched only by the rush of adrenaline it provoked. It was a sentence of damnation, and yet it was a sentence of life. Elias looked at Dalton. He remembered Dalton sharing his tobacco 2 weeks ago. He remembered Dalton talking about his wife in Connecticut, about the garden she kept. He tried to summon the face of the man, the friend, but his mind could only see them meet. The hunger was a solvent, dissolving the personality, the soul, leaving only the organic matter. The revulsion welled up in Elias's throat, acidic and burning, but it was battered down by the screaming demand of his cells. Every instinct screamed no, while the deepest, oldest part of his brain screamed yes. "It is a sin," Finch wept, though he did not look away from the body. "God will not forgive us." "God is not here," Elias said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears, cold and detached. "God stayed on the shore. Here there is only the sea, and the sea wants us dead. If we do this, we live. If we do not, we are Dalton by tomorrow." The sun began to dip, casting long, distorted shadows across the boat. The twilight brought a false sense of privacy, a cloak under which they could hide their shame from the heavens. The decision settled over them like a shroud. There was no vote, no show of hands. It was a consensus born of agony. They drew their knives. The sound of steel sliding from leather sheaths was sharp, shocking. These were tools of their trade, used to cut rope, to splice line, to carve scrimshaw. Now they were instruments of an abomination. Morgan moved to the body. He was the strongest, the one who had stripped blubber from whales 100 times. He handled Dalton not with malice, but with a terrifying professional detachment. It was necessary to view the body not as a shipmate, but as a resource. To hesitate was to invite madness. Elias watched, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He saw Morgan's hand tremble just once before the blade made contact.
The first cut was the hardest. It was the crossing of the Rubicon. It severed the tether to the world of men. With that single stroke, the social contract was voided. The act that followed was a blur of grim, butcherous necessity, performed in the gathering dark. They worked in silence, a pantomime of horror. The air grew thick with the metallic scent of copper, a smell that triggered a violent, confused reaction in their starving bodies, nausea warring with voracious appetite. Elias forced himself to help, his hands slick, his mind retreating into a fugue state to protect itself from the reality of what his hands were doing. He was a spectator in his own body, watching a stranger perform a ritual of the damned. They were shedding the final vestiges of their societal morality, peeling away civilization layer by layer until only the animal remained. When it was done, when the portions were distributed, they sat in the darkness, isolated in their own private hells. The meat was raw, cured only by the salt air and their desperation. Elias held his share, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He looked at the dark shape in his palms. It was salvation. It was damnation. He closed his eyes, tears squeezing out to mix with the grime on his cheeks. He brought it to his mouth. The smell was overwhelming. The first bite was an act of violence against his own conscience. He gagged, his throat seizing, his mind rebelling. But then he swallowed, and the body took over. The relief was instantaneous, electric, sickening. The stomach, dormant for so long, roared into life. The rush of energy was dizzying.
The sun was no longer a celestial body. It was a hammer. It hung suspended in a sky the color of bleached bone, beating down upon the open whaleboat with a malice that felt personal, intelligent, and unyielding. There was no wind. The Pacific Ocean, a vast, indifferent sheet of hammered obsidian, stretched out to the curvature of the earth in every direction, a prison without walls. Inside the boat, the silence was louder than any gale. It was a silence composed of shallow, ragged breaths and the creaking of timber that had long since dried out, much like the men who inhabited it. Captain George Pollard sat in the stern, though the distinction of rank had evaporated days ago, distilled into nothingness by the great equalizer of starvation. His eyes, sunken deep into sockets that looked like bruised hollows in a skull, stared at the horizon, but he saw nothing. He was looking inward, into a catalogue of failures. The hunger was no longer a sharp pain in the belly. It had transcended physical sensation to become a state of being. It was a cold fire in the marrow, a slow dissolution of the self. The body was consuming itself, metabolizing muscle, then fat, and now it seemed to be eating away at the very soul. The men, Pollard, Charles Ramsdell, and the young Owen Coffin, were barely recognizable as human. They were grotesques, caricatures of life drawn in charcoal and ash. Their skin was stretched tight over protruding bones, blackened by the sun and covered in salt sores that refused to heal. Their lips were cracked fissures, bleeding slightly with every movement. They were waiting for rain that did not come, waiting for a ship that would not appear, waiting for death, which hovered over the gunwales, patient and inevitable. The gruesome sustenance they had derived from the previous deaths had run out. The bones of their former shipmates had been picked clean, gnawed upon until there was nothing left but dry calcium, and then cast into the deep. Now the hunger was back, with a vengeance that screamed in the silence. It had been days since they had eaten. The water was gone. The delirium was setting in, bringing with it visions of banquets in Nantucket, of cool streams in the Massachusetts woods, of rain that tasted like sweet wine. It was Charles Ramsdell who broke the silence. His voice was a rasp, the sound of dry leaves skittering over stone. He did not look up from his hands, which were clasped together, trembling with a palsy that had nothing to do with age. "Captain," he whispered. The word hung in the stagnant air, heavy and unwanted.
Pollard slowly turned his head. The movement required immense effort. The tendons in his neck stood out like wires. "Yes, Charles." Pollard's voice was a croak, barely audible. "We are dying," Ramsdale said flatly. It was not a complaint, merely an observation of fact. "I know," Pollard replied. "We must wait. God will provide." "God has turned his face from us," Ramsdale said, lifting his head. His eyes were fever bright, burning with a terrifying lucidity amidst the wreckage of his face. Or perhaps he is waiting for us to act. We cannot survive another day, not all of us. Pollard felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He knew what was coming. He had feared this moment since the first pangs of hunger had struck weeks ago. It was the unspeakable logic of the sea, the grim arithmetic of survival. "What are you saying, Charles?" "I am saying," Ramsdale continued, his voice gaining a terrifying strength, "that if we do nothing, we all die. Tonight, tomorrow, it matters not. We are dead men drifting. But if one were to die, so that the others might live..." He trailed off, the implication hanging between them like a blade. Owen Coffin, curled in the bow of the boat, stirred.
Coffin was next. The boy dragged himself upright. He looked at Pollard, then at Ramsdale. He licked his cracked lips. He reached into the hat. His hand was small, the wrist bone prominent. He hesitated, his fingers hovering. Then, with a sudden, jerky movement, he snatched a paper and pulled it to his chest. Ramsdale took the final slip. He set the hat down. "Open them," Ramsdale whispered. Pollard unfolded his paper. It was blank. A wave of relief so potent it felt like nausea washed over him, followed instantly by a crushing weight of guilt. He had survived, which meant one of them had not. Ramsdale unfolded his. Blank. Silence. Absolute, terrifying silence. They turned to Owen Coffin. The boy sat frozen, the paper clutched in his hand. He had not opened it. He didn't need to. The process of elimination had already sealed his fate. "Owen," Pollard whispered. Slowly, with the inevitability of a nightmare, Coffin opened his hand. He unfolded the paper. There, stark against the white of the chart, was the black smudge of charcoal, the mark of death. The boy stared at it. He did not scream. He did not cry. He simply stared, as if trying to comprehend a difficult mathematical problem. Pollard felt his heart break, a physical snap. "No," he said. He scrambled forward, ignoring the weakness in his limbs, and grabbed the boy's shoulder. "No! Owen, give it to me!" Coffin looked up, dazed. "Captain?" "Give me the lot," Pollard pleaded, tears finally spilling from his dehydrated tear ducts, burning trails down his soot-stained cheeks. "I will take it. You are a boy. I promised your mother. I promised her. Give it to me." Pollard tried to snatch the paper, but Coffin pulled back. A strange calm settled over the boy's face, a maturity that had no business existing in one so young. "No, cousin," Coffin said, his voice gaining a surprising steadiness. "The lottery was fair. We all agreed. If I take your place, I am a murderer. If you take mine, you are a suicide. The lot is mine." "I cannot let you die," Pollard cried, his voice cracking. "I am the captain. I order you." "You are not the captain now," Coffin said softly. "We are just men, and I drew the lot." Pollard collapsed back against the gunwale, sobbing dry, hacking sobs. The heroism of the boy was more devastating than any cowardice could have been. Coffin had accepted the grim pact with a stoicism that shamed them all. "We must finish it," Ramsdale said. His voice was devoid of emotion now, purely mechanical. He was already distancing himself from the act, turning himself into an instrument of necessity. Who will do it?" Pollard could not speak. He shook his head violently, burying his face in his hands. "We must draw again," Coffin said, "to see who helps me." Ramsdale nodded. He took the 2 blank papers. He marked one with the charcoal. He placed them back in the hat. "Captain," Ramsdale said, "you must draw." Pollard looked up, his eyes red and wild. "I cannot." "You must." Pollard reached into the hat again. This time he prayed for the marked paper. He prayed to be the executioner, thinking that perhaps the guilt of killing the boy would be a punishment fitting for his failure to protect him. He pulled the paper. Blank. Ramsdale drew the remaining paper. He looked at it. The black mark stared back at him. Ramsdale closed his eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath. He and Coffin had been friends. They had served on the same watch. They had shared jokes and dreams in the early days of the voyage. Now, Ramsdale was to be his executioner. "I am sorry, Owen," Ramsdale whispered. "It is not your fault, Charles," Coffin replied. The boy shifted, trying to find a comfortable position. "Make it quick, please." Ramsdale reached for the pistol.
The 91st day rose not with hope, but with a searing white malice. The sun was no longer a celestial body, indifferent and distant. It had become a personal tormentor, a hammer of light that struck the open boat with rhythmic, silent blows. There was no horizon anymore. The line that separated the sea from the sky had dissolved weeks ago, melted by the salt crust that coated the eyes of the 2 men remaining in the captain's boat. There was only the blue void above and the black void below, and they were suspended in the purgatory between, rotting while still drawing breath. Captain George Pollard sat in the stern, though "sat" was a word that implied human posture, a dignity long since abandoned. He was a heap of rags and angles, a biological ruin collapsed against the gunwale. His skin, stretched tight over the architecture of his skull, had taken on the color of old mahogany, burnished and cracked by the elements. His eyes were deep craters, retreating into the bone as if trying to hide from the glare, yet they burned with a feverish, unnatural luminosity. Across from him, Charles Ramsdale huddled, his body curled around a small, precious pile in the center of the boat. They did not speak. Speech required moisture, and moisture was a memory. The only sound in the vast, indifferent Atlantic was the slap of water against the rotting planks and the dry, rhythmic clicking of Ramsdale's teeth against something hard and white. They were drifting through a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing the air out of their lungs. The ocean was calm, a sheet of hammered lead reflecting the pitiless sky. It was a calm that mocked them, a serenity that belied the horror contained within the 20-foot wooden shell. There were ghosts on the water, spirits tethered to the mortal coil by the sheer animalistic refusal to die. The hunger had changed. In the beginning, weeks ago, or was it years, the hunger had been a sharp, screaming pain, a clawing beast in the belly demanding to be fed. Then it had become a dull ache, a constant companion. Now it was something else entirely. It was a metaphysical state. It was a void that had expanded from their stomachs to consume their minds, their memories, their very souls. Pollard looked at his hands. There were skeletal claws, the tendons standing out like wire rigging, the nails long and curved. He tried to remember what they used to hold. A sextant? A harpoon? A wife's hand? The images were blurry like watercolor paintings left out in the rain. The only reality was the boat, the sun, and the bones. The bones were the center of their universe now. They lay in the bottom of the boat, bleached and splintered. To any other eyes, they would have been the stuff of nightmares, the grisly remnants of a taboo so ancient and profound that civilization was built to wall it out. But to Pollard and Ramsdale, they were sustenance, they were life, they were the earthly remains of Barzillai Ray, and before him, Owen Cotham.
The names had ceased to carry the weight of personality. They were no longer the names of kin or crewmates. They were the names of sacrifices. Pollard watched Ramsdell gnawing on a knuckle bone. The sound was distinct, calcium grinding against calcium. It was a sound that would echo in Pollard's ears for the rest of his life, waking him in the sweat-soaked sheets of Nantucket beds decades from now. But in this moment, it was the sound of survival. There was no revulsion left. The biological imperative to exist had scoured away all morality, all squeamishness. They were operating on the basest level of existence, the reptile brain driving the machine, even as the machinery fell apart. Pollard felt a thought form, slow and viscous like sludge.
The shape grew. It was white canvas. It was the topsail of a square rigger. A ship of men, a ship of the living. The realization did not bring joy. It brought a sudden violent shock, a terror that nearly stopped his heart. It was an intrusion, an alien object entering their closed system of death. For 90 days they had been alone with God and the devil. The arrival of a ship felt like a violation of the sanctity of their suffering. Pollard tried to shout, but only a croak emerged. He waved a ragged arm, a feeble gesture against the enormity of the ocean. The ship was moving closer. It was the Dauphin. They could not know the name, but they saw the hull, the dark wood, the men moving in the rigging like ants. It was massive, a floating city compared to their splinter of wood. It tacked, turning into the wind. It had seen them. The realization hit Pollard with the force of a physical blow. They had been seen. The isolation was ending. The horror was no longer a private secret. It was about to be exposed to the world. As the Dauphin approached, the wind carried the sounds of the living, the creak of spars, the flap of canvas, the shout of orders. These sounds were deafening to ears attuned only to the silence of death. A whaleboat was lowered. Pollard watched it hit the water. Oars flashed in the sunlight. 6 men pulling together. They looked like giants. Their arms were thick with muscle, their faces flush with blood and health. They rowed with a vigor that seemed impossible. Pollard shrank back against the stern. He felt a sudden irrational urge to hide. He looked at the bones at his feet. He looked at the half-eaten remains. Shame, dormant for weeks, suddenly flared up, hot and agonizing. He tried to cover the bones with a piece of canvas, but his hands were too weak. He looked at Ramsdell. Ramsdell was not looking at the ship. He was still clutching a femur, his eyes darting back and forth, terrified that these intruders were coming to take his sustenance. The whaleboat drew alongside. The oars were shipped. The rescuers peered over the gunwale. Pollard saw their faces change. He saw the curiosity turn to confusion, then to shock, and finally to a horror so profound it distorted their features. The silence that stretched between the 2 boats was heavier than the ocean itself. The rescuers were staring at 2 skeletons covered in parchment skin, their eyes wild and feral, surrounded by the splintered ruins of human skeletons. They saw the cracked skulls, the hollowed-out rib cages. They saw the blood caked around Pollard's mouth. They saw the madness in Ramsdell's eyes. One of the rescuers turned away and retched over the side. Another crossed himself, his face pale as the canvas above. "In the name of God," whispered the mate in the stern of the rescue boat. "Who are you?" Pollard tried to speak. He wanted to say, "I am Captain George Pollard of the Essex." He wanted to say, "We are men," but the words would not come. He was not a man anymore. He was a creature of the sea, a consumer of the dead. He simply stared back, his eyes burning with the terrible knowledge of what survival cost. The rescuers reached out. Hands, warm and fleshy, grasped Pollard's arm. The touch was electric, burning his cold skin. He flinched. He felt himself being lifted. He was light, weightless, a bundle of dry sticks. He was passed over the gunwale into the rescue craft. It felt alien. It didn't rock with the same sickly rhythm as his own boat. Ramsdell was next. He struggled.
He didn't want to leave the bones. "Mine," he rasped, clutching the femur. "No!" The rescuers had to pry his fingers loose. They threw the bones into the sea.